Seeing as the Dark Ages is a term for the early Middle and also occasionally the entire Middle Ages, today we're going to bounce all over this timeline with our virtual time machine. I'm talking punishment devices, ways to die, how high risk being a performer was, and more. What's something you associate with the Dark Ages? Let me know in the comments and let's see what we got. So among the many diseases people had to fear way back when was the King's Evil, which was a form of tuberculosis that caused black lesions all over the neck, which would rupture and leave open sores. Really bad things. Now the only cure for this was a touch from a king or queen. King Henry alone touched 1,500 people suffering from the disease, though it's not clear how many he cured. Now how this touch was done was a whole process in and of itself. Now throughout the years, the monarch would touch or stroke the face or neck of the infected person, and they would hang a coin around the person's neck to signify that they had been touched by a royal. Passages from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John were read. Now Mark 16 contains themes that confirm the monarch's immunity to infectious diseases, saying, "They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Prayers were offered, and until the English Reformation, the prayers were addressed not only to God, but also to the Virgin Mary and other saints. Now this disease rarely ever resulted in death. And fun fact, it often went into remission on its own, giving the impression that the monarch's touch cured it. And the kings of France were the only Christian rulers who claimed the quote-unquote divine gift. Now the ritual was normally performed between Michaelmas and Easter, when cold weather made it less likely to contract a disease from an infected subject. It was believed that the treatment was more likely to be successful if performed on a holy day. Now, English monarchs generally touched less frequently than their French counterparts. In England, St. Edward the Confessor was said to be the first monarch to possess the healing power of this royal touch. Now the French, on the other hand, who normally trace the origins of their monarch's divine gift back to Philip I or even Robert II, denied that St. Edward used the royal touch. They insisted that the first English royal to claim the ability was Henry I, and that his touching was a politically influenced imitation of the gift granted exclusively to the French. They claimed power was most notably exercised by monarchs who sought to demonstrate the legitimacy of their reign and of their newly found dynasties. So two Dark Age punishment methods used simple devices and the force of gravity to inflict unimaginable pain. The Judas Cradle was a pyramid-shaped spike that a victim would be forced to sit on so that it penetrated their rear end. Now, the time of this punishment also varied from victim to victim, depending on various factors other than their own ability to bear the pain. So, if you're on this, your hands and legs would be tied so that your weight cannot really be shifted anywhere else, and your feet were commonly tied with each other with the goal of increasing the pain whenever there was movement. Sometimes a weight was added to your legs, which, increased the pain, also resulted in a quicker death. Other times, oil was put on the device, which again, increased the pain. There would usually be multiple folks operating a Judas Cradle. One person in charge, everybody else helping out. Now, the Judas Cradle is not to be confused with another similar device called the horse that was popular in Prussia during the same period. It derives its name from the biblical figure of Judas, by the way, the one who betrayed Jesus Christ. It was believed that the device was named after Judas as a means of punishing those who were deemed to have betrayed their fellow man. Now, the Spanish donkey, on the other hand, used a similar principle, but victims would straddle a wedge-shaped board with a pointed top. Now, punishment inflictors would strap weights to the feet of their victims to increase the suffering, and by weights I mean cannonballs. Hey, that's what they had lying around. The Book of 1086 tells us that about 74% of the population of the English countryside wasn't exactly free. Serfs, cotters, boarders, and slaves were all bound to serve to a lord for life, and needed his permission for every major decision, even marriage. In most communities, the king technically owned all the land in the area, and he would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty. Then these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. This privilege for barons came at a great cost to the serfs. Now, serfs were the poor mass of people who had no land and no rights. They were essentially treated as slaves by the local nobles. They toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn until dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock, and offer some other value to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you're going to stay there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor, unwashed masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. So if you were sentenced to death in Europe, you'd probably hope for something quick, like a beheading. Certain execution styles were actually designed to make death as long and painful as possible, like drawing and quartering, for example, required the victim to be dragged behind a horse, rope necklaced until almost, but not quite dead, disemboweled while still alive, and then pulled or chopped up into about like 4 pieces. Medieval crushing involved placing the accused's head in a device that slowly crushed the top and sides of the head together. Eventually, the eyes would pop out, the skull would crack, and everything would break. Boiling to death was usually reserved for poisoners, coin forgers, and counterfeiters. It involved being flung into a cauldron of boiling water or oil, and the accused would slowly scald to death. Impalement meant to be impaled or stuck through a large, sharp object, such as a metal spear or pole, and left to die. And this corporal punishment was regarded as one of the most shocking public forms of executions, and was often given to suspected witches, women found guilty of killing their offspring, and any kind of harm to folks under legal working age. The Battle of Hastings, which was the great encounter between the Saxons and the Norman invaders, got off to a slow start. The Saxons had the high ground and didn't want to sacrifice their advantage by charging. The Normans coaxed them into charging though by sending a juggler out. Now the Saxons were confused by his juggling, and when he concluded by hurling a spear into their line, they lost it and charged. So during this time period, juggling was one of many skills performed by entertainers and buffoons. Don't look at me, I'm a crappy magician. If you were an English king in the Middle Ages, your chances of making it through a peaceful reign were kinda slim. Edward II and Richard II were both deposed, Henry II faced rebellions from his own descendants, and King John died while fighting to regain his throne. Harold Godwinson and Richard III died in battle, and Richard Lionheart was killed by a chef with a crossbow. So where do people go for fun in this time? Well, try the cemetery. Cemeteries weren't exactly hidden from view or enclosed within walls. They were the hopping place to be. Back in the Dark Ages, popes were embalmed with spices and rubbed with a good white wine. Wealthy people were often buried in more than one place, and cemeteries turned into, body selling places at night. In the Dark Ages, cemeteries could be the social hub of the community, hosting theater performances, local elections, trials, and lots more. They were also a place of business. Shops and cemeteries were exempt from taxes, and if that doesn't sound amazing to you, you've never owned a business before. The church preached that resurrection was spiritual, but most folks assumed that resurrection would be physical, so they would camp out in cemeteries and wait for the dead to come back. Though nowadays most of us hope for a quick and easy death, this was considered the worst way to go way back when. That's because dying without the chance for confession and last rites meant that your deceased spirit would wander restlessly forever. Quick deaths were therefore associated with sinners and killers, while slow, drawn-out deaths were for respectable people. Medieval people actually had the concept of a perfect death. It was a long, slow decay. The agony was prolonged so people would do their acts of contrition, pray, confess, be absolved, and finally pass knowing that all would be well afterwards. Sudden and quick death meant that God was punishing you, so you had no time to prepare for a safe passage to the afterlife. So way back when, people rarely drank water because of the risk of disease, and while fresh spring water would do in a pinch, a lot of people turned to the most sensible alternative: booze. It was perfectly common to drink a large amount of wine, ales, or cider, meaning it was also perfectly common to be drunk as a skunk most of the time. 10:30 a.m.? Guess I'll crack a cold one. But what do you drink when the hangover finally sets in? I believe the old wives' tale is that if you stay drunk, you'll never feel the hangover. And finally, before the big invention of fake bakes and spray tans, paleness was the must-have beauty trend. Way back when, white skin was viewed as a sign of modesty and virtue in a woman. However, a pure white porcelain complexion is almost impossible for a healthy person to attain naturally, so women went to extreme lengths to whiten their skin and attain that highly sought-after virtuous look. It was also done for medical reasons. The practice is like really old, but became fashionable in these years. Redlining was the practice of making a small incision in a person's arm, and then you squeeze out enough fluid until, you get really pale. And hey, if that kind of grosses you out, don't worry, we've got leeches. Put one behind your ear, we'll get plenty out. Europeans were so into this. They even had texts advising which saints' days were the best for this wild activity, and charts showing which parts of the body were best to source from, all according to the zodiac. And that's it from me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.